eye-grabbing title, ain't it? Almost to the point of being confusing. All it means is that The Defenders is as close as any of the Marvel Netflix shows have ever come to feeling like the Marvel movies, or rather, as close as they've ever come to feeling like how most people who aren't me view the Marvel movies. Incredibly entertaining, but ultimately disposable, buoyed almost entirely by charismatic cast and fun action that helps you ignore until the show is finished that the story is ultimately pretty shallow and the villains turn out to be really weak. To further clarify exactly what I mean, I'm someone who thinks that there's more to most Marvel movies in terms of brains and theme than anyone wants to give them credit for, and I even find more to like than anyone else in the villains that people just love to complain about. I may be overstating, but it just kinda baffles me that after enjoying 2 years of accolades as the better, grittier, more grounded extension of the MCU by people who can't quite fully get into the movies, Netflix releases easily the worst show in quick succession with what's essentially the Marvel movie formula done on a micro-budget. The Defenders is an exciting, over-the-top thrill ride, even when it's paced pretty evenly, with a huge emphasis on character relationships and group dynamics, but it's important to note it does have a sense of style and presentation all its own. Those of you who, like myself, gravitated to the use of color in the marketing are going to adore how that plays into the show itself. To clarify, each series has been color-coding its protagonist. Daredevil red, Jessica Jones blue, Luke Cage yellow, and Iron Fist green. Each show has been mostly subtle about it, but Defenders goes all out in associating each color with each character, in ways that I would detail, but I really don't want to ruin the effectiveness of certain color beats for anyone who has yet to see the show. Needless to say, characters are constantly surrounded by their colors, or sometimes they'll swap or mix colors when interacting, adjacent scenes will have completely different color grading, and it always gets me just how much it works as a visual motif. So much so that it makes it hard to skip the opening theme even when the tune itself is really bland and boring. I'm pretty iffy on the series' score in general, actually. I like it sometimes. Other times it feels way overblown and kinda cheap sounding, almost like it's coming from the cheesier version of this show we would have gotten in the 90s. Even the better tracks don't feel like anything we've gotten out of the previous 4 shows, though I might be the only one who feels that way since I haven't heard anyone else mention it. Style only goes so far if the story is lacking, and I'll admit that seeing these characters together was something that in my mind could have gone very badly. After the cacophony of failure that was Iron Fist, Danny Rand in particular was the biggest wildcard going into this series, not only because his show was so pants, but because Danny himself was an intolerable protagonist. Thankfully though, if The Defenders proves one thing, it's that the only one at fault in Iron Fist was probably Scott Buck. Not only is Finn Jones clearly more at home with this material than he was in his own show, with a better fight choreography to boot, but even What's-His-Face, who was easily the worst actor in that show, has some decent line deliveries here. As expected of a show not written by hacks, Defenders gives Danny the character arc that you would have expected him to get in Iron Fist, laughably and thankfully making that show a mostly pointless watch outside of a couple plot points. I feel so bad for Finn Jones. Most people, myself included, were really critical of the guy's acting chops in his own series, and while he's no Robert De Niro here, he's holding his own with Cox, Coulter, and Ritter fairly well. I think I can confidently conclude that the real issue with Iron Fist was its showrunner and not its talent, which frankly makes me really nervous about Inhumans. Within 3 episodes, The Defenders gives Danny a more defined, consistent, and worthwhile character than he'd ever gotten in 13 hours of his own show. Really, the spectacular grasp this show has on all 4 of its leads is something to be commended. With the biggest story of the 5 shows and significantly less time to tell it in, Matt, Jessica, Luke, and Danny all feel like heightened versions of themselves, meaning bigger laughs and bigger drama. Honestly, this whole show is so heightened next to the others, both stylistically and in terms of writing, that for the first time I can honestly, truly picture this corner of the MCU interacting with the characters from the films. After the whole roster seemed almost ashamed of having come from comic books, Defenders comes right out and declares itself in all but actual words, this is a show about superheroes. And man, do the Defenders have as much fascinating chemistry as any other super team. Just don't call them that. A lot of hubbub was made in interviews about how much these 4 would butt heads, and while that absolutely does happen in mostly natural ways, there's also a palpable camaraderie between them all founded in respect and empathy. Guys, you have no idea how much of a relief it is to come out of this show thinking Luke and Danny actually really work as a pair. On a first viewing, the one thing that was a tad disappointing about the group dynamic was that Jessica Jones seemed to have the least character stuff to do. Going into this show, she was my favorite of all the leads, and by God, was getting more of her after a 2-year absence more than worth it to watch this whole thing. to the point where I'd call her the highlight of the series. My issue was that she seemed to have the least presence of the four ideologically, but when you think about it, that's kind of perfect. It's in keeping with her own series, where Jessica herself has a desire to keep things as simple and straight to the point as possible. And part of what makes her relationship with Matt Murdock so great is how they contrast on that front. Jessica wants to keep her life simple and grounded, Matt plain can't stop himself from overcomplicating things. Both want to help people, but just likes having a life to herself, while Matt constantly ditches his normal life for a whole other identity. Jess always likes to take the path of least resistance, and is the most resistant of the four to the H word, while Matt has a martyr complex like bad. It's ironic that her show was probably the darkest and most grounded of the whole lot, since here she's the best example of character traits being turned up to 11, to the point where she's pretty explicitly the Defender's comic relief. I know how that sounds and that it might put some people off, but she's an effective comic relief. Again, not to say that there's no depth to her, or that the three boys don't provide a fair share of laughs as well. Like I said, the relationship between the four of them is really what carries this as a viewing experience. So if the heroes represent everything that works about the show to near perfection, then a big part of the show's failings is how little there is to the villains. The higher-ups of the Hand get a lot of screen time, but aren't motivated by anything deeper than survival instinct. They've got a philosophy against death, which frankly I thought was done better in Doctor Strange. And while you'd think having Sigourney freaking Weaver cast as main villain Alexandra would guarantee a striking and memorable role, that's sadly not what we get. For a moment, it seems like we're really doing something unique with her, playing her up as a patron of the arts, and paying off the importance of New York as a setting by having her be really tuned into the city's culture and history, but all that gets dropped real fast. The most interesting thing about Alexandra is how she plays into the color motif, being represented by all white, and while you could read some into that, she just doesn't hold a candle to Wilson Fisk, Mariah Dillard, or Kilgrave. Yeah, Kilgrave was kinda shallow, but that was part of what made him terrifying. Even Diamondback had more going on with him, and everyone hates that guy. Madame Gao is a great villain who's sadly shortchanged here, just like she was in Iron Fist. Gao, along with Alexandra's other co-conspirators, butt heads with her fairly often, but by the end of the show are just flunkies. After 2 seasons of Daredevil and all of Iron Fist building up the Hand while still portraying them pretty unremarkably, it sucks that this is probably the definitive end to the Hand arc of this franchise, and it goes out with such a whimper. If not in presentation, there are hundreds and hundreds of ninjas after all, then in the fact that these guys just aren't interesting. To quote Movie Bob quoting himself, somehow the Marvel Cinematic Universe has managed to make the most boring thing about itself the magic ninja death cult. I am curious as to what the next big recurring adversary will be now that we're done with these guys, but I just wish that after such a large presence across all of these shows that they'd actually manage to be something cool. As it stands, I have to scrounge for positives to say about them. Speaking of things that are underutilized, it genuinely shocked me just how little of a role Rosario Dawson as Claire Temple played in the proceedings. She's been the connective tissue of all these shows, but here she's barely relevant until the 3rd act. She does bring Danny and Luke together, and I appreciate what of her we do get. I'm not even necessarily disappointed at all, I just suppose I assumed she'd be playing a bigger role. Honestly, outside of the villains being just plain no good, I think assumptions are the root of a lot of my issues with the show. Namely, assumptions based on how the show was marketing itself and how the creators talked about it in interviews. The interactions between the main characters, for instance, while very interesting, also lean pretty heavily on the whole found family trope that every other team in the MCU has built itself around. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with the found family trope. I love the found family trope. The found family trope is probably why I love this franchise as much as I do, but I feel like I was led to believe that wasn't what we were getting, and I was interested to see how a more adversarial group dynamic would play out. But for all the talk of the Defenders being more grounded and human and less sentimental than the Avengers, this show is basically that movie stretched to 4 times the length in terms of structure and how the team gets along with each other. I suppose I find it interesting that there's no real team leader, and no one seems to be vying for that position, although Luke is definitely the adult of the group, but that's beside the point. The point is, I know there's probably a few people who were expecting this to be the deeper, more serious, philosophically engaging version of a superhero team-up because it's on Netflix. That's just not what it is. Honestly, if this show and Iron Fist teach me anything, it's that whether they're enjoyable or not, I just have to stop expecting the Netflix Marvel shows to be nearly as fascinating or deep as their first couple of outings. I know that's kinda harsh to say, but somewhere along the line we stopped treating these shows like high art and more like generic popcorn fare. And yet still at points a bit too self-serious for its own good. The Defenders is a very simple and straightforward team adventure about stopping the bad guys who want a mysterious MacGuffin. Cut, print, let the action scenes, the performances, and the character dynamics carry the whole joint. I feel like the one way to make the show noticeably better without having to put any more effort into the villains would be to lean harder into that. It's ironic considering "it's complicated" is practically the series' catchphrase. It sounds like I've been complaining a lot so far, and the sad thing about this video coming out as late as it is that I can already tell this is going to be one of the more net positive looks at the show. I know everyone I make a point of following is decidedly more negative about it than I am, at least. Defenders has a lot of problems, but coming off the heels of a show that I abhorred as much as Iron Fist, I think it says something that I couldn't help being giddy throughout the whole thing, even on a second watch-through. It's not the strongest of the Netflix shows. In fact, in terms of the amount of real problems I have, I think it's second only to Iron Fist, but where that show was boring and reproachful of its source materials, Defenders is an unironic, whiz-bang action romp and character piece. The bits that do work so well that I'm almost never not enjoying myself. What more recommendation do you need? Thanks for making it this far into the video, everybody. Normally this is where I would say that you can request another property for me to review, but from Catwoman to Doctor Who to Supergirl to every season of Teen Wolf, I think I've got a bit too many outstanding requests as it is. Add to that the fact that I'll be back in school by the time you watch this video, and my upload schedule might get pretty wonky for the foreseeable future. Not to say that I'm gonna let the channel gather dust, but do know that if things slow down big time, it's because I'm busy with more pressing stuff. That said, if you want to see those videos the moment they come out, just go ahead and subscribe. I'll be sure to let you know when requests are open again, and until then, I hope you enjoy what I put out.